Hi, welcome to Train Signal. We're talking about deploying certificates from certificate services in this portion of the Windows Server 2012 Advanced Services course. And we're going to talk specifically about the role of templates. When I want to be able to build a house, I do it based on a blueprint. When I want to get from one place to another, I do so with a roadmap. When I want to deploy a certificate, it's going to need a template. It needs some sort of a plan for how that certificate is going to get laid out, and for what purposes we're going to use it, and who's it going to be useful for, how long is it going to be able to be used. There's a number of important details that we need to configure depending upon the role of that template and how it's going to get used in our environment. So we're going to focus on those ideas in this section. Microsoft has rolled out a number of different template versions over a period of time. Microsoft added certificate services to the Windows platform with Windows 2000. At which point, it was a brand new idea, at least in the Windows world. And all of the certificate templates, the kinds of certificates that I could issue, were the very first kind that Microsoft offered. Those were referred to as version 1.0 certificates. Well, when Microsoft rolled out Windows Server 2003, they found that they had some other new kinds of uses for templates that they hadn't even thought of when Windows 2000 came out. So they added version 2.0 templates. Version 2 templates were preferable to version 1 in part because there were new kinds of certificates that we could roll out. But in addition, beyond that, version 2 gave us a neat capability. We could make a duplicate of an existing 1.0 template and make a version 2.0 template out of it. And I could now take advantage of the neat new abilities of version 2. Version 1, the best I could do was set permissions for whether you could enroll for a certificate based on that template or not enroll for a certificate based on that template. That was about it. Version 2, I can configure all sorts of detailed settings. Version 3 added yet new interesting technologies to our available set of opportunities. Version 3 certificates support something called CNG, support something called the Suite B cryptographic settings. And now with Windows Server 2012, we've added yet a fourth version. We're actually on v4.0 in the Server 2012 release. So certificates are a very important part of being able to manage a certificate server. Knowing which certificates you're using for which purposes is vitally important. Knowing how they're going to get used, who's going to be able to use them, and why is a very important configuration that you're going to need to perform on any CA or CAs that you use. And specifically, we want to make sure that we've identified whether you're able to roll out certificates on an automated basis using something called auto-enrollment, or whether it's necessary to manually request a certificate, to contact some certificate authority administrator and ask, would you please assign me a certificate for such and such a purpose. There are environments where the use of both are appropriate for different circumstances. I might want to automatically enroll my full-time employees, and I might want to be able to issue certificates manually for contractors, for example. And that's an example we'll deploy here. So let's jump into the server environment and see how certificates get configured. So here we are on Server 2. I've configured Dallas Server 2 as a Certificate Authority server. Let's take a look at how certificates are currently being managed on this box. If I go to the Tools menu, I've got access to a Certification Authority snap-in. I'll go ahead and launch that. Within that CA, I've got a description of certificates that I've made available or haven't made available or have denied access to. What I want to be able to do is configure the support for templates. And here they are. These are the templates that are currently what are referred to as published by the CA. The CA theoretically is able to issue certificates based upon these definitions of kinds of certificates that can be used. If I want to set up a web server for SSL purposes, I can create a web server certificate. This is for server authentication, for a server to prove its identity to a client. So the client feels comfortable making that credit card purchase or transferring a bank balance or things of that sort. Here's a certificate for EFS, the encrypting file system. This is a certificate that allows a user to encrypt personal files of their own in a way that ensures that those files are kept safe from harm, even if some evil villain steals the computer and extracts the hard drive and puts it in their own computer. Those files are still scrambled, kept safe from harm, and remain that way unless unscrambled by somebody with the private key. We do have a user authentication certificate that does embed together encrypting file system features, email features, client authentication, the client proving to somebody else, to some server, that it is who it says it is. So let's imagine that our Global Mantex company has decided to begin hiring contractors to perform certain kinds of tasks in our network. We've decided that our core competency isn't so much IT. We're better off bringing in people to perform some of those tasks. We want them to be able to authenticate themselves using certificates, but we tend to hire those people for a fairly limited period of time. Corporate IT puts their heads together and says, okay, issuing certificates to these people, that's a good idea, but we want to make sure that those certificates are short-lived, they get renewed fairly frequently, and that any time that a contractor wants a new certificate, they need to get approval from somebody who runs the CA. So how do we do that? If I just go right-click the certificate information here, I can pull up some properties, but there's nothing to do here. This is information about how that certificate works, but I can't make any changes to this. So how do I change the behavior of the user template? The solution to that is to actually right-click the certificate templates container and to manage templates. This launches a separate Microsoft Management Console snap-in. I could alternatively have gone right to that from the MMC, but I kind of like using this trap door into the certificate templates MMC, and there it is. So let me scroll down through my list here, and we do see the user certificate does exist in this list. So if I go right-click the user template, I have an option here to duplicate that template. Now, why would I want to do that? Why wouldn't I just go change the properties of the certificate template that I care about? Well, there's some limitations to that. If I click Properties here, I cannot change most of the interesting properties of this certificate. In fact, mostly what I can change is security rules, identifying who is able to request a certificate of this type, or informal certificate authority speak, to enroll for that certificate. What if I want to change some of those other properties? Well, the right thing to do is to right-click that template and create a duplicate. When I do, I get to say which versions of the OS this is supported for, or in other words, which template version we're using. On the General tab, we can specify a name for this template, something that makes it adequately descriptive of what we're using it for. Well, in this case, this is the template that I'm using for my GlobalMantic contractors. So I'm going to name it GlobalMantic Contractors template. I get to specify how long it's valid for. Let me say maybe 2 weeks. It's telling me here that the renewal period doesn't quite match. By default, a certificate can be configured to attempt to auto-renew at either 80% of its usage or at some shorter period if I would prefer. I can have it attempt to renew every, for example, 1 week. Or I could say that I want to renew every 10 days. So every 10 days they can re-request a renewal of that certificate. That certificate will be usable for a maximum period of 2 weeks at any given period of time. When a certificate is assigned to an individual, it identifies that person or that computer or whatever by a piece of information called a subject name, and we can see a tab for that here. I can let the user supply information about themselves, or better yet, if that user who's connecting in to get that certificate is already a member of Active Directory, I already know lots about that user. I can go build information by pulling in information from Active Directory. I can identify the subject name from the common name, just the first part of the name. Ideally, we'll do it using the distinguished name, the DN. This is the fully qualified description of that user account and exactly where within the directory that account lives. It's inviting me here to include the email address of that user in the subject name. In this case, I haven't configured email addresses for users in Active Directory, so I'm going to leave that unchecked. I'll do the same for the alternate subject name, or what's sometimes called the subject alternate name. In some cases, I want to be able to identify the person who's been assigned that certificate in more than one way. The main way is the subject name. The alternate subject name provides the other ways that I want to go about it. I might want to identify that user by UPN, user principal name. That's the username at domainname.something format for a Windows username. You'll recall that corporate IT policy in this example dictates that our contractors need to ask permission to get that certificate. In other words, that somebody who manages the CA needs to manually approve the deployment of those certificates. So to do that, I'm going to go to the Issuance Requirements area and turn on the option that says this particular template requires CA Certificate Manager approval. I could go on beyond that to identify that I need a certain number of people to approve that. And I can set a follow-on policy to configure whether the rules are the same or not when someone re-enrolls for that certificate. The last part of the template configuration I want to focus on for the purposes of this lesson is security settings. The security rules identify who is allowed to read information about this certificate. To be able to get a certificate based on this template, you need to be able to read it to see what it's used for, and you need to have permission to enroll for it. Beyond that, it's possible to give someone permission to make changes to the settings of that certificate, accepting, of course, the ability to change permissions, or to give full control, which includes all those other abilities plus the ability to change these permissions. And there's a fifth policy option, a fifth permission option I haven't defined yet, this idea called auto-enroll. And auto-enroll is an option if I want to allow a computer to request a certificate on an automated basis thanks to the assistance of group policy. I'll dwell on that idea in just a moment. In this case, I want to allow manual enrollment only, so the enroll option is appropriate, as is read, without which I wouldn't be able to gather the information about the policy to be able to even begin the process of enrolling for it. Having done all that, I'm going to click OK, and I've configured a version 2 template. Note that I made a copy, a duplicate, of a version 1 template. What came out is a version 2 template. That was because I chose compatibility with Windows XP, Windows Server 2003. If I had chosen compatibility only with Windows Server 2012 and Windows 8, that would have then been a version 4 template. Now, I'm not quite done as of yet. I've configured that template, but I have not yet told my CA that it should make that template available. This CA is again what we call an enterprise CA, which means it's integrated with Active Directory. And specifically that means that all of my templates actually live in the Active Directory database. So the fact that I've configured this here really is not a configuration of the CA proper, it's a configuration of Active Directory. To illustrate that point, let me drag this portion of the window to the right here a little bit. And you can see that the certificates templates tool is focused at Dallas Server 2, which is in fact a domain controller. I'm reading this data out of the Dallas Server 2 DC. Let me go ahead and close up the Certificate Templates console, and I'm back at my Certification Authority window. You'll note importantly that my GlobalMantic's Contractors template does not appear in my template list. Even if I were to highlight it and hit F5 to refresh, still not there. To make that work, I throw another right click at Certificate Templates and choose the option to create a new issuance of a certificate template. I want to effectively activate that template, which is living at present in Active Directory, and make it active and effective on this CA. Having selected that, I can go find my template in this list, and sure enough, there's my GlobalMantic's Contractors template. I'm going to click OK. That now does appear in the list. It's now possible for someone with appropriate permissions, and in this case it's authenticated users, it's everybody, to go request a GlobalMantic's Contractors template. So let's jump to a client computer and go see this from the perspective of a user who wants to get a certificate of this type. So here we are on the Windows 8 client. Let me jump to the desktop. Actually, before I jump to the desktop, let's go right to the tool for managing certificates right here from the Windows Start screen. I'm going to launch the tool called Cert Manager, certmgr.msc. MSC flags it as a Microsoft Management Console utility. And there it is. In this tool, a user can manually request certificates that they've been given permission to gain access to. So, for Nelson to be able to do that, Nelson's a contractor here at GlobalMantic's, we're going to right-click Personal, and under All Tasks, Nelson's going to request a new certificate. As he does so, he gets some information about what he needs to supply to be able to make that work. He needs a network-connected computer. He needs permissions to get those certificates. We've already accomplished that on the server side, so we'll click Next. Next, we get to choose which certificate enrollment policy defines the set of certificate templates that Nelson can choose from. In this case, we've only got the one, the Active Directory policy, so we'll leave that selected and click Next. And there we see the GlobalMantic's Contractor certificate appearing here among the certificates that Nelson can request. Now note that the user certificate is also in there. That certificate is configured by default for any user to be able to request. If I wanted to make sure that contractors weren't able to use that certificate and can only use the GlobalMantics Contractor Cert, I might go back to my CA and configure the user certificate so that members of the contractor group, if I had one, deliberately are denied permission to enroll for that certificate. In this case, though, we'll just move forward with the simple case of Nelson requesting the certificate that he's been authorized to get. I'm going to click Enroll. That triggers an enrollment request. And you can see that our request is in the enrollment pending state. I chose the option that said the administrator gets to approve whether or not we allow a particular certificate to be issued or not. So all Nelson has done is put in the request that says, I'd like a certificate of this type, please. He's now going to pick up the phone and go call the administrator. He's going to go call the help desk. He's going to go talk to whoever his liaison is with the company and say, hey, I put in my request for my cert. I need a CA manager to approve it, please. So let me click Finish there. That drops us back to the Cert Manager tool. Now let's go to the server side and approve Nelson's certificate. So back over here on the server side, we're going to go visit the list of pending requests. And there's the request from Nelson. The request has been taken under submission. The request completed successfully. If I right-click it, I can pull up some details about that particular request. Specifically, if I go look at the list of extensions, I can see that the subject alternate name is Nelson at GlobalMantics. Okay, Nelson. Yep, he's a contractor. We just hired him last week. Sounds right. Looks good. I want to approve this request. Well, how do I do that? I'm going to right-click that request, come on down to All Tasks, and issue that request. Unless, of course, I decide that this person isn't trustworthy, isn't, in fact, a contractor, in which case I might choose to deny. Depending upon which of those two I choose, the request will be migrated either into the Issued Certificates area, as it was in this case, or into the Failed Requests area if I had denied it. In this case, it is now an issued certificate. It's issued to somebody who's named Nelson. If I throw a double click at that row, and I can see that this is a certificate assigned to Nelson Portier, thanks to the efforts of the Dallas Server 2 CA. We can see that the Server 2 CA was the issuer, and that certificate is valid for a period of 2 weeks. And we can see that that certificate was issued by our CA. That's obviously important. This certificate knows where it came from because that certificate is itself digitally signed by the certificate of the parent CA. So now that we've created the certificate for Nelson, we need to install it on Nelson's computer so that he can use it. But because Nelson submitted this as a administrator managed request, it wasn't, in other words, an auto enroll, but because this was a manually issued request, an administrator moderated request, Nelson doesn't have an easy way to be able to reconnect into the results of the request and retrieve that information again. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and drop a file on his computer that contains that information. I'm going to double click the certificate again to step inside of it. And as I look at the details of that certificate, I see an option to copy this certificate to a file. When I do, I'm in the Certificate Export Wizard that allows me to take all the details about this certificate and save it to one of a variety of different kinds of files. I'm going to take the default here, the DER encoded X.509 binary. I need a name for that file, and I'm going to call it Nelson Certificate. And I'm going to go browse right onto Nelson's hard drive, if I can get there from here, and drop it there. Double backslash Windows 8 client backslash $C$. So I'm going to drop that file right here at the root of Nelson's C drive. Looks good. We've exported the certificate. Let me jump back over to Nelson's computer and let's make it part of his certificate store. So back here on Nelson's computer, I want to install the certificate that we just got done putting on his hard drive. The way to do that is to go back to his personal certificates container, right-click it. Under All Tasks is the option to import that file. Now what I don't want to do is go request a new certificate, because if I do, I'm issuing an entirely new request to generate a certificate to the CA. The CA manager is going to call me and say, hey, wait a minute, I think you just got a certificate of that sort. Why are you asking for another one? I want to import the one that I already have, which is to say that's existing in a file on my hard drive. It wants to know which certificate store to copy it into. In this case, it's the user-specific one. I'm importing a user certificate. It wants to know, where's the file? Well, I've got it sitting on the root of my C drive. So let me go browse for that. And there's Nelson's certificate. Now, instead of copying it onto my hard drive, I could have, as a certificate authority manager, I could have emailed it to Nelson. I could have put it on a USB stick and handed it to him. That'd be even more secure. So I got a number of options that way. Having identified the file, we're going to click Next. Where do I want to put it? I'm going to put it in my personal store. Alternatively, I could choose other locations if they were appropriate. In this case, it's a personal certificate. It's for Nelson, so that's exactly the right choice. We're ready to do the import. We click Finish. And if I refresh Nelson's personal certificate container, we can see that our import succeeded, and inside of Nelson's certificates folder is a certificate issued to him by the Dallas CA for the purposes of client authentication and secure email and EFS and all those sorts of good things using the GlobalMantic's contractor certificate. Nelson's a contractor. He has a contractor appropriate certificate configured for him. Now, once we get sophisticated at manual assignment of certificates to users, we then start to consider the possibility of having to do this for dozens or hundreds of users, maybe thousands, maybe tens of thousands of users for large organizations. And that suddenly becomes a task that I really don't want to have to do manually. What I'd rather do is automate that. Well, that's going to require a little bit of extra work. Not lots, and certainly it is going to be a huge time saver as opposed to manual assignment of certificates of the sort that we just did here. That feature is driven thanks to a couple of important features. One of them is the ability to trigger the auto-enroll permission on a certificate template. You saw that come by earlier. If I set a certificate template for auto-enroll permission, that means that it's possible for somebody to say, hey, I'd like that certificate, can I get it please, and have the CA issue it without any assistance from the user at all, and without any assistance from a CA administrator at all. The other side of that equation is configuration in group policy. So let me jump over to a domain controller for a moment, and let's look at the group policy settings appropriate to that particular bit of behavior. So here on my domain controller, I'm going to go configure group policy to support certificate auto-enrollment. In my group policy management console, I'm going to build a new GPO attached to my domain that's going to deploy certificate auto-enroll rules to my whole domain. I'm going to click OK on my certificate auto-enroll policy GPO creation, and I'm going to go ahead and edit that GPO. I'll right-click and edit will bring me to the group policy management editor to edit that individual GPO. I want my users to be informed that they can do certificate auto-enrollment, so I'm going to go User Configuration, Policies, Windows Settings, Security Settings, Public Key Policy Settings, Public Key Policies. Inside of which, you'll note that I have an option to configure auto-enrollment for the Certificate Services client. Let me open that up and say, yep, I would like to enable certificate auto-enrollment. I have an option to trigger automatic renewal of certificates that are in their update period. I have an option to turn on certificate updating. I can configure logging behavior around the behavior of certificate expiration. All that done, I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And while I'm here, I'm also going to go ahead and configure the certificate enrollment policy. With that turned on, you can see that we're enabling the Active Directory enrollment policy for all the users in my domain. You'll recall we chose that manually in our use of the manually configured tool. Here, I'm enforcing that behavior through group policy. I can even go so far, if I choose to explicitly exclude the possibility of users to choose a different enrollment policy on their own through that GUI. If I leave this unchecked, they would be able to create their own. That's an advanced topic outside of the scope of what we're going to talk about in this lesson, but that's what that's intended for. Having done that, I'll click OK, and we've configured domain-based certificate auto-enrollment. It's worth noting that this is another way that Nelson might have gotten the certificate that was manually assigned to him. If a certificate server manually assigns an IP address to somebody, then a third way that that user can get a hold of that certificate, in addition to the file export process or a file by email, a third approach is for this auto-enrollment to take care of it. because if the CA has approved a certificate for a particular user, the auto-enrollment process will automatically make that happen. So we've seen how to configure a CA to allow a user to be able to get a certificate from the CA, and we've seen how to configure a client computer to go get the certificate that it gets from the CA. In some cases, though, I want to play a variation on that theme, where I want to allow one user, an IT staff person, to be able to preemptively issue requests for certificates on behalf of users before the user actually logs into a computer. I might be creating, for example, smart cards for the benefits of a particular user. Well, how do we accomplish that? Well, there is a technique for that. To support that scenario, I can create something called a restricted enrollment agent. And the idea of an enrollment agent in general is that I can assign to someone the permission to create certificates on behalf of other users. In the past, though, that was an unlimited sort of a thing. I can give somebody the ability to create any certificates they want for any user, but I couldn't put any limitations on it. One interesting recent innovation is restricted enrollment agents, where I can limit which templates the restricted enrollment agent can use when assigning certificates to a user. To support that behavior, Microsoft has rolled out an additional certificate template type specifically for creating certificates that give someone the permission to be an enrollment agent. So let's go take a look at the certificate template and see what that tells us about the way this behaves. So back here on Server 2, I'm going to go visit my certificate templates collection. You'll note there's no enrollment agent certificate here in this list. It's a template that has not been published on this CA. So I'm going to go right-click my certificate templates collection and manage to drop into the certificate templates snap-in. So here in the certificate templates area, I know that we do have an enrollment agent template. I'm going to right-click it, pull up its properties, and in its security tab, I can configure for somebody, and I can identify exactly whom, the ability to enroll for an enrollment agent certificate. Now, having done that, what does that do for a user? Well, that depends on configuration settings on the CA itself. So let's assume that I've assigned that permission to a certain somebody. In this case, I'm going to cheat and just assign that permission to authenticated users. Real world, you don't do that. Real world, you pick a particular somebody, probably somebody in IT who's trustworthy there. Having done that, I'm going to go back to my main CA window. I'm going to right-click the properties of my CA, pull up its properties, and you'll note that we have an Enrollment Agents tab here. By default, we're using the old school approach of not restricting enrollment agents. But note that I can deliberately restrict enrollment agents for Server 28 and later CAs in such a way as to insist that certain enrollment agents can deploy certain certificate templates targeted at particular collections of users. So that's a very rich bit of functionality to be able to carefully customize exactly for whom an enrollment agent is allowed to configure certificates. So with that, you now have the raw materials with which to be able to begin deploying certificates to the users and indeed computers in your organization. With those certificates, you can begin setting up IPsec communications. You can configure secure web servers. You can encrypt email messages that contain sensitive materials, and you can set up for other sophisticated configuration tools like ADRMS. And I look forward to introducing you to some of those ideas and some of the other lessons in this course.